He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney.
And this is
The Musical Innertube.
Now, you may ask, why is this podcast called The Musical Innertube?
And we may reply, because that's its name, of course.
Now, how did this podcast get that name?
Back in college, we hosted a radio show. Once, we tried to introduce a soothing musical interlude.
Instead, we messed up and wound up introducing a soothing musical innertube, and the name stuck.
So here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking
To interesting people about their interesting lives.
Difference makers who really make a difference.
With all of the crap that's going on in the world, it's so much fun to sit down and talk about something like cartoons. And we're going to do that today with Jerry Beck, who is a writer, animation producer, and author of more than 15 books on animation history, a former studio exec with Nickelodeon Movies and Disney. He was instrumental in launching Animation Magazine. He's written for The Hollywood Reporter, IndieWire, and Variety. And right now he's on the faculty of both Cal Arts in Valencia and Woodbury University in Burbank, California, teaching animation history. Jerry, welcome to the Musical Innertube.
Oh, happy to be here. Love music.
Yeah, and this is all about music, as anybody who's listening can tell you. Jerry, I would assume if I said to you, how did you first get involved, or how did you first get interested in cartoons, your answer would be sitting in front of the television as a kid. Is that about right?
True. Yeah, absolutely. That's, of course, anybody of a certain age. That's how you got introduced to cartoons. If you were older than that certain age, you might have gotten introduced to cartoons in the movie theaters where, the animated shorts that we still enjoy today used to run in front of feature films, just like we watch trailers or, coming attractions. They used to run cartoons. That was a staple of going to the movies.
Yeah, that's how those Warner Brothers cartoons got.
Yeah, by the way, I forgot to tell you that you even asked me just one little question. I can probably talk for the whole hour without letting you guys get in a word in edgewise. So I'll have to watch myself and feel free to interrupt.
You're the lazy podcaster's heaven sent person. That's great.
Yeah. I don't think that's going to happen, Jerry. But, so how did you decide that you were going to become, I want to say, academically involved in this, that you wanted to explore that history and preserve it for all time?
Well, I mean, I've been academically involved for real for the last 10 years or so, and I didn't know there was a job in doing that. I knew there were some places where that could be. You'd have to be in those certain places, like in New York City or out in California here, where there might be a school that might teach animation and they might want a class or something on the history of animation. But before that, I was a fan and I was a professional in the movie business. And I've somehow Forrest Gumped my way through a whole bunch of stuff. I've been involved with producing. I've been involved with film distribution and home video, writing about the history of animation, kind of both as a hobby and then professionally. Kind of done almost all of that stuff, and all that stuff sort of led me to imparting this sort of information to the rest of the world, either via books or through classes that I'm teaching in Los Angeles. And I first thought, I just want to mention that about 10 years ago, and I was approached to teach a class on the history of animation, I really took it like, what's the right term? I mean, I didn't take it seriously. I was like, really? You mean you want me to walk in and show Bugs Bunny and Fred Flintstone? And what do you, it's like a babysitter job. I didn't know what I was getting into, but the minute I got into one of the schools, I saw how serious the students were in wanting to become animators and related fields to that, and film students, and that they were, 20-somethings who did not grow up with the animation that we might have grown up with, or they didn't know some of the classic names in animation, Chuck Jones and the Max Fleischer Studio. So I suddenly, literally within the morning of the first class that I started, it just completely dawned on me as, okay, I have a mission now, kind of for the rest of my life. I have a mission to make sure that the younger generation is aware of who these people are. And this was at a time like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, where right now at this moment, you can actually get up in the morning on certain channels and watch, or streaming services, and you can see some of the classic Warner Brothers cartoons and Popeye cartoons and Disney cartoons. But you couldn't do that like a few years ago. So they really, and even today, you kind of need a curator. You need sort of somebody who's telling you what these are. Otherwise, you have no idea what you're looking at when you're watching, these classic old cartoons and things.
So let me ask you a question that's very unfair. Now, obviously, animation as a commercial enterprise in the United States has had several peaks, right? You've already mentioned some of them. I mean, if I asked you and of course we're living at a peak now, I think, of just an explosion of motion capture and CGA and all the tricks. So in some ways, some of the most recent cartoons have been some of the best of the movies that you could go out to see. So tell me, what is a beautifully animated cartoon? It could be from any period. What's one that you especially appreciated, just the look of it and the way it moved, and it can be trees and flowers. Right. It could be The Rabbit of Seville. It could be a Wile E. Coyote cartoon. It could be Frozen. But I'm just wondering, I've been asked that question for years. My problem in answering it, I'll give you some kind of an answer soon. But my problem in answering it is that I actually am such a fan. I just love animation all over the place that I see the good even in things that are a little weaker. And you know what I mean? I'm more of an optimist for animation than a critic of animation. So I have a lot of favorite cartoons. In fact, in recent years, mainly because of my classes and my running certain cartoons over and over and over again, I started to compile some lists of films of animation that I never get tired of. And I did a couple of blog posts about those. So I mean, I'm not counting features, of which, there's a lot of Disney features. That's fair enough. Sure.
Well, one that's at the top of my list isn't even a funny cartoon. It's the first Superman cartoon that was done by the Fleischer Studio back in 1941. I don't know if you know it, but it's Superman versus a mad scientist and a death ray. And I've seen it so many times now. But it still holds up. It's still thrilling to me. They never had done that before. Superheroes were brand new. Superman was a new thing and quite a sensation in the late 30s and early 40s. And bringing that character to life, there were no, we're living in a world today of anime and Batman cartoons and this and that, Johnny Quest. None of that this is 20, 30 years before that. And it's done in such a wonderful high style. And it's been acknowledged as a inspiration for a lot of the later filmmakers, including Brad Bird, who did The Iron Giant and The Incredibles, and Hayao Miyazaki, the great Japanese animator, I've looked at that series as the thing they start with as doing that sort of thing. But as beautiful cartoon, I mean, all over the place. Disney is the winner when it comes to beautiful cartoons. There's funny cartoons. There's all sorts of things I could point to. I'm sorry to give you this belabored thing. I'm not giving you a quick, Rabbit of Seville kind of an answer. I actually did a post about my 10 favorite Bugs Bunny cartoons, and there's some strange things on there, but they're my favorite ones. They're the one with Chuck Jones did with the very first one with Wile E. Coyote, genius.
Yes.
Genius. That's a hilarious cartoon. Now, that's a hilarious cartoon for a Bugs Bunny cartoon and the acting of Mel Blanc, but, cartoons that Chuck did like One Froggy Evening with the singing frog and Feed the Kitty with the big bulldog and that little kitten that he just loves. I mean, those are masterpieces, mainly in pantomime. So I could give you a 3-hour answer on my favorite cartoons and animation pieces. That's essentially what I actually show in my classes. So
when I was introducing my granddaughter, who's now 10, to these, because I have all of the DVDs that Warner put out a few years ago.
Oh, good. Then you'll see me all over them.
Yeah.
Audio commentary.
That was one of my introductions to you, Terry. And I showed a couple of them to her when she was smaller, thinking, hey, she's a kid, she'll love them. And her only question was, why are all those people hitting each other? And I hear, well, okay, maybe she's not old enough. But later on, I showed her, and the one that she glommed onto was the Bugs Bunny cartoon where he's in vaudeville and Yosemite Sam wants to see the show.
Oh, yeah.
And there's the tall ladder with the jump into the pool of water. And there's the segment where whoever directed that one, I don't think it was Chuck.
It's Friz Freeling.
Friz Freeling, yeah. And there's just the intermediate part where all you see is Sam going up the ladder, Sam coming down, Sam going up the ladder, Sam coming down. And you have to imagine what's going on at the top of the ladder.
Right.
Those sort of things, again, that subtlety, it was just, she was laughing the whole time. She thought it was the funniest thing. So yeah, you're right. I think the pantomime of cartoons is as important as the lines. Although I think when we went into television cartoons with Hanna-Barbera, that's, I think, maybe when the voice work became a little more important.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, TV, they couldn't possibly do what they were doing in theaters for TV. It was two completely different things. Times had changed. The cartoons they made for theaters in the 30s and 40s and into the 50s were, I like to always emphasize this to my students, that they really weren't aimed at kids. They were kind of aimed at the general movie-going audience, which included adults. They knew adults were watching. They're really beautifully crafted short films is what they are. The TV animation was, as Chuck Jones unfortunately said, illustrated radio. Basically, they were dialogue scripts and very limited animation. But the money in the beginning wasn't there. And by the way, it's there today. I mean, the what used to be in the 60s, 70s, even the 80s, 90s, the difference between television animation and theatrical animation were, miles apart. Today, the stuff they're producing for the new streaming services and whatever is pretty darn good. There is no line anymore. I actually have to learn to stop calling it TV animation. It's series animation is what I call it now. And it's pretty good. So we're definitely entering a new phase. I love it. I love that. I love progression in animation. I love to see things we haven't seen yet. Animation is you can do anything. It's a blank piece of paper. And, the animators who do some new things with it, not forgetting the old, definitely have my attention. I'm drifting into other topics here, but recently with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, a perfect example of taking the adventure cartoon, the comic book, and melding it into a new look for what I call adventure animation.
I would say watching that, I really didn't it never occurred to me that it was animation. I mean, it was almost like watching live action to me.
Wow, that's great. I like hearing that. I agree with you. That's how it should be. It should capture you so you forget kind of what you're watching. Again, Disney did this. Disney did this even with Snow White in 1937. Did it with his other films where it's animated, it looks great, and then you begin to get caught up into where it didn't really matter in a way that it was animated. And what was great about Disney films and the great even animated films that are made today is that they do things in theory that we can't do in live action. Before CG, there were a lot of things we couldn't do in live action. We couldn't have a Lady and the Tramp, or maybe film something like the exciting climax of Sleeping Beauty with the dragon. Today, we could probably do that stuff in live action. So animation films have to find themselves, what can we do that's going to make our film, stand out, be better? Why are we even doing it in animation? And I think the Spider-Man was one of the examples of that answers that question.
Well, okay, so all these actors who've made in the last 20 years, voiceovering has become this huge thing where it wasn't so much in the forefront before. They never even used to list people's voices. And now it's treated pretty much the same as acting with your face in front of a camera. It's
Yeah, it's like a subcult now because it used to be people who used to do radio shows, and they used to have those actors do the cartoons, and then there were just actors who do voiceovers for commercials and things like that, and there was a whole community of people who just did voiceovers versus the on-screen actors and on-screen talent. And now we're living in a world where there's more celebrities getting involved because animation is more accepted in the last 20 years or so.
Oh, yeah.
So you get more people like, let's say, Amy Poehler. I mean, I love some of these people. I love these people. People are on all the primetime shows. Even some of the kids' shows are pretty famous names. And then there's still that subcult of the people who just do the cartoons. Tom Kenny, a guy named Eric Bauza. My wife is Cheryl Chase. She's the voice of Angelica on the Rugrats.
Oh, goodness.
She has there's a whole little, universe that knows who she is, and she goes to conventions and signs autographs, and, luckily in the real world, nobody recognizes her. They have a wonderful secret identity. It's kind of cool.
Well, that was kind of my experience in radio. We've talked to a couple of radio friends of mine on this too. And the fun part is you can be anonymous as long as you don't open your mouth.
Yeah.
Well,
even then, they might not sound like the character,
Yeah. Well, that's true. That in radio, you unfortunately your voice is your passport.
So how about, since we did touch on it, I'd like to talk a little bit about sound. Mm-hmm. And I think, from the beginning, sound has been such an important part of cartoons, and certainly, cartoons have helped technology advance on several tracks at once, both the animator's art and the movie making art and the art of sound. And I just love watching the very, very earliest cartoons because, of course, they have to be made to a soundtrack that it's got a single microphone, and it's got the guys with their scripts standing certain number of feet away, a guy with a bongo and jingle bells and whatever else he's going to use for the sound effects. And then an orchestra behind all of them. And there's a script for all of that. And so that's one level of, very sophisticated timing and artistic unity. Everybody's got to be aware of everybody else's cues. But from that moment on, they always push the boundaries, and today we have things like, I don't know, I'll go back to Frozen for a minute, which are amazing experiences in sound as much as sight. That there's just things that happen in that film, and it's not the only one. It's just one that I thought of, where it seems to me that we think of cartoons as primarily visual, and they never have been, at least what we're talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would still say they're primarily visual, but certainly sound design has changed throughout the years, and it's possible that animation, Disney in particular, pushed it along. Disney did the first stereo film, which was Fantasia. Most people don't realize that. They were way ahead of the time with the idea of doing, having the sound like like you're actually in a real concert. So they actually recorded that in stereo and released it that way. They called it Fantasound. And they were a proponent of that through the 50s and later. A lot of what you see on film is propelled by the sound. If you actually look into Disney history, their story room was not called a story room. It was called where they actually would concoct the stories and pin up the boards, and it was called the music room. Why was it called the music room? Because sound was so important to the film. Whether it was a song that was going to be in the film or even just musical beats that they would animate to. And early on in the 30s, the description you just gave of how an animated film is recorded is a little fanciful. They did do that in the early 30s. It was like that. Certainly the Fleischer cartoons with Popeye, because we were all, if you love those old Popeye cartoons,
yes,
black and white, he does a lot of these little ad libs where they're not even animating his mouth. It's just,
And he's just mumbling. He's just mumbling stuff,
right. And so the mumbling is actually I want to say residue, if that's not the right word, but it's a result of the fact that it's voice actor Jack Mercer, who is one of their story men, actually. And he knows the story of what's going to happen in the film, and he's recording to the picture like you described, but he already knows what's going to happen. So he's like, I wonder what's over here. He's basically, he knows that Popeye's going to go over to this other door, so he says it out loud. That's really what it is. And so that's a case where that worked. They, unfortunately, by 1940, they stopped doing that. If they recorded it first, they figured out a way, which still exists today, where they recorded first and they figured out exactly what frame of the film, at least that's the way they did it then with film, but what frame that little sound that you're emitting from the mouth is going to show up on. So they animate right to that. So they can have a character go, hello, and you'll see the character mouth the word hello, right. And that's how they do it. Now, Carl Stalling, Disney's music man in 1929, 1930, and later was the main music man behind all the great Warner Brothers cartoons.
What a giant, right?
Yeah, he was. But when and this will even make him gianter, when he was brought out he was brought out to LA by Disney because he was the guy who was conducting the orchestra, playing the piano at the Newman Theater in Kansas City, Missouri, the only theater and musician that Walt Disney knew because he came from Missouri. He had him come out and work on these cartoons, and then he ended up staying. And Stalling is the guy who actually said to Walt, we could do a little symphony, a little fun music thing, and you can animate to it. And that became the Silly Symphonies series. And also in kind of reversed how they do the sound by recording it first and then doing the picture to it.
Now, was Stalling also the one that in the Warner Brothers cartoons used music as sound effects? When Sylvester walks up the stair, it goes ding, 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 ding.
But that's famously called Mickey Mousing. And that in the music industry, any of your musician friends or anybody does soundtracks for movies, they call that Mickey Mousing when you do it, when you're doing the music exactly to that actions. And the thing is, they call it that way because it started with Carl Stalling at Disney in 1929 and 30, because they were synchronizing the cartoon directly to the sound, which was a miracle in 1928, 29, 30. People, this is something I'm sorry, you got to cut out all the references I make to, this is something I say in my class. But in those earliest days, people were just getting used to seeing people talking. They're used to, in real life, a person and words come out of their mouth. The concept of an animated cartoon having sound and then the voices match was like science fiction. That's why Mickey Mouse became what it did. It was amazing to audiences. Literally, dare I use the term Disney magic, but it was magical to audiences that this was this other world of cartoons, and they have their own, dialogue and music and sounds and all that. So, but that kind of exact synchronization comes from there. Again, even live action movies from 1928, 29, 30, 31, 32. If you go back and look on TCM on any movie of those dates, you won't hear any background score. There'll be music over the titles at the beginning or something, but you won't hear any music during the film. It's almost dead.
Right. I think the first movie to have a complete soundtrack was Rain, right? That Joan Crawford movie. I think that was the first.
That was one of them. Famously, I thought you were going to say more famously, one of them was King Kong.
Yes.
And I don't know this. I haven't read this anywhere, but I think they kind of did that because there isn't that much dialogue in King Kong. It's mostly them running through the jungle.
Right. And then he says, "Beauty killed the beast" at the end of it, and the end.
Yeah, there is dialogue.
I think one of the things that Stalling and Disney discovered between them was that if you sync up the sound with what people are doing in the image, it actually psychologically gives the viewer more of an impression of weight and actual existence, right? When a person's making noises, because that's the way that we live, we expect in most people's world, sound is synced up.
Right. That's why when Disney did Steamboat Willie, it literally was an overnight sensation, propelling Walt Disney and the name Mickey Mouse. That suddenly meant to everybody for decades. It meant cartoons. And it just literally meant animated cartoons. There's lots of references to Disney and Mickey Mouse that have nothing to do with cartoons because people were using those two expressions to mean animated cartoons. Before that, believe it or not, there was at least one, maybe even two animated cartoons released with sound to the new theaters that were being wired for sound, but they're nothing but a silent cartoon with just some background music. That's all they are. No synchronization. Disney did synchronization. That was the big key.
We'll have more with Jerry Beck in a moment, but first, this soothing musical Innertube.
Jerry is the editor of two cartoon-based websites, cartoonresearch.com and animationscoop.com.
Some of the many books Jerry has written are The Animated Movie Guide, The 50 Greatest Cartoons, Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies, and Not Just Cartoons, Nicktoons, an overview of 31 cartoons that appeared on Nickelodeon.
And he co-authored a book with film critic Leonard Moulton titled Of Mice and Magic, A History of American Animated Cartoons.
You'll find ways to contact Jerry on both the Cartoon Research and Animation Scoop websites.
And now, back to Jerry, Don, and John on the musical Innertube, a fairyland. In thinking back over those old Disney cartoons, and of course, John and I were introduced to them, probably you too. I don't want to say Saturday morning, I want to say weekday mornings.
Yeah.
A lot of television stations, especially local stations, bought huge batches of these old cartoons. My wife remembers fondly watching Farmer Gray every morning when she woke up when she was like 6 or 7 years old. But again, when you think of the old Disney cartoons and those old cartoons from the 20s and 30s,
the Bosco cartoons, right? Bosco.
You think of a menagerie. It's all about farming. It's all about agriculture. It talks to, people who are comfortable with chickens and roosters and all that. And then as you get into the 40s, there's a little more urbanization, and then you get into the war. What I'm getting at here is I think that the cartoons reflect the time probably more than we realized.
Yes, good observations. One reason they reflect chickens and farms is because mainly Disney. Once Disney was the overnight sensation he was, he led the pack. He never let up on progressing what animation could be, ultimately working up towards a feature later in that decade, 10 years later, from Steamboat Willie to Snow White. Think about how quickly the thing is, though, Disney being the leader, pretty much the other Hollywood studios copied him or followed him. And so that's why the other ones did it. The exception were some of the New York studios like Max Fleischer, whose cartoons were pretty urban in the first place. He did, as you know, in the 30s, Betty Boop and Popeye.
Absolutely.
Those are kind of darker and a little more, again, city-wise. But yet even he had to occasionally have. That's why he had Bimbo and animal characters and things that because that was the trend of that period.
As I remember, Betty Boop's boyfriend was a dog.
Right. That was Bimbo. Yeah. Bimbo. Did you love that? The Fleischers was so off Disney that everybody else had Oswald and, Crazy Cat, and Fleischer had Bimbo, But you were right. My favorite part of your observation is that they were topical of the time. They reflected the Depression, or they were the flip side. They were trying to get people to forget about the Depression by doing, musical cartoons that made people forget for a moment that they had no money in the bank. And then the war comes in, and of course, there's many, many cartoons that reflect what was going on at the time. Bugs Bunny versus Germany and Popeye versus the Japanese. And the reason for that was when they made those cartoons, there was a couple of factors, but one was that they did not think that anyone was going to see these things in the future. They did not think about television or even reissuing them in a few years. That was not part of the plan. Cartoons were just a thing of that moment, similar to if anybody still reads the physical newspaper, there's some comics, and you read Blondie today, and you throw the paper away, and you don't think about that anymore. And that's the way animated cartoons were in their day. They were of that. They were ephemeral, as they call it. They were of that time, and with no possible thought of the future. So, that of course changed obviously later on. They didn't even know they would sell them all to TV in bulk like that. And for a long time they couldn't, because the movie studios were at war with television in the 1950s, because television was watching movies at home for free. And that was the opposite of the business that the movie industry was in at that time. So there's answers to all the questions of why things were and why we saw them the way we did. There's usually some business reason for that.
I am really struck by just how well written the cartoons of the past 20 years are, whether it's the Toy Story cartoons, whether it's Sing, whether it's Despicable Me. They are, when I say well written, I mean tightly written, tightly scripted. They've got interesting characters. You look at Aladdin, and that's really well written. Obviously, the music's really well written. They let Robin Williams riff.
One day I'm going to have to ask Dad Stones his story about trying to edit Robin Williams. They let him go forever, and then somebody had to sit down and put it in pieces, and unfortunately, Tad is the one that had to do that.
These seem to be made to last to some extent. They're fun. They're of their moment, but it just seems as though too much care has been put into them to be quite that ephemeral.
Well, yeah, obviously the last, obviously since the 1960s, the animators are well aware of there's a future for these animations, not just, quick one-off showings. They're, as an older gent, I've seen, the cartoons go from, the perception of animation back in the 60s and 70s, which I feel is the lowest point for animation. The 60s, 70s into the early 80s, the perception was animation is for children. I'm talking about the United States, by the way, but in this country, it was a babysitter thing. It was Saturday morning. People like me who are around, interested in this subject, have been fighting the good fight for a few decades to change people's minds and that perception that animation is just a kid's thing. And it's not just me, it's everyone who works in animation that knew this. And it took a couple of opportunities, to get us where we are today. There were some wonderful game-changing things that have happened since, I'm going to say the mid-'80s or so. Things like, obviously, Roger Rabbit and Menken and Ashman getting involved at Disney when, Eisner and Katzenberg took over Disney in the 80s, and they brought in stage people to come up with things like Little Mermaid, Aladdin and Lion King. And so then there was a renaissance in the 90s. And even then there were still cartoons that were kind of babysitters you just didn't want to sit through. But we've gotten to a point now where I'm a collector, but I'm more of a collector of the information about what's been going on with feature films in particular. I did a book called The Animated Movie Guide, which was basically a list of all animated features released in the United States up until the publication of the book, which was in a long time ago now, 2004. So it goes right up to The Incredibles, and that's about it. But still, that's a good place to stop, because we sort of hit the landing pad we're in right now, where animation features are aimed at everybody, thank goodness, just the way it used to be. Classic Disney movies where you could still watch, I was going to say Bambi, but I can talk about that for 3 hours. Bambi's a drama. Bambi's not the film they advertise it as. So I mean,
it's a tragedy. It's it's very tragic.
So I mean, animation has this weird loopy history, and it's coming back around to being accepted by all in this country. The kids have grown up. We realize animation's a medium for telling these kind of stories that can do anything.
So you have Disney flooding the market with these wonderful cartoons which are made for kids and adults. They're also made with such care that we're still watching them now. I mean, they've aged very well. I mean, in fact, I think they're making the ultimate compliment to these cartoons by remaking them.
Some of the Warner cartoons, they're also doing brand new series that look like 30s and 40s cartoons. I'm thinking of Cuphead and Cat Burglar on Netflix that looks like Tex Avery from the 1940s. Everything old is new again, as they say. I like to say Back to the Future is my little expression for when I talk to students, because the one way forward is to look back, take, and you infuse your own style and move forward. That's been a mark of success for most of the more successful TV series in recent years or decades in some cases. It's also been how even the Disney Renaissance began, because they were trying to go back to the fairy tale film, like you just said, like The Little Mermaid, and go back to those kind of things, because right before that they were doing, what were they doing? Doing good movies, but they had some misfires like The Black Cauldron.
Yeah.
Right. They had these weird things that they were trying to be hip, but they weren't being true to being themselves, being Disney. And that's all well and good. And we're at a really great point right now. I mean, a lot of my contemporaries always like to kind of bitch about, what's going on in animation today. But I think we're still stuck, or some of them are stuck in a 1970s, 80s, even 90s mindset. Today, in the 2020s, we're in a very good place. There's a lot of great stuff being done, what I call pioneering of techniques, storytelling. I mean, people are doing documentaries in animation. We're doing all sorts of different things, using that field. Yes, sometimes there's some series and movies that are, definitely R-rated for violence and all that. But you know what? I want animation to try it all and, get to a place where, which is what I think Walt Disney wanted, which was a place where animation is just as easily accepted as any other form of filmmaking. It's not thought of as its own genre. It's just another medium, another way of telling a story. And I think that's where we're heading. That's what we've been doing. And at the moment, we're in just such a good place. I don't even see an ending. I don't see how it's going to fall apart right now, because there's just too many markets and outlets. There's too many things propelling the field right now. And that was part of the problem in the 70s and 80s. It was just Saturday morning and an occasional feature of some sort.
Pretty unimaginative stuff compared to something like, I don't know, The Simpsons or South Park. There you have the longest running TV show on prime time in American history, and it's still going strong that I hear. I don't think they're thinking of stopping anytime soon.
When you see The Simpsons being canceled, animation's renaissance is over.
Yeah, I think so. Hey, from the way you're talking too, I think that you're not falling into the class of people who poo-poo CG, or say that the computer-generated animation is not real animation or anything like that. You don't believe that, right?
No, I don't believe that. I mean, there's a lot to be said about all of that. I think the industry itself, Disney in particular, there's been a lot of confusion about how exactly to use CG right from its beginning, as a tool. Where we're at now, I mean, where we've been for a long time, is that there's two camps. There's obviously CG to make a lot of the live action movies and TV shows we know. In fact, some of them I don't even think could exist without CG. I call that the special effects side of CG, and that's cool. There's always been special effects, and using CG for that is great. It's gotten obviously to such a photorealistic level that we can just see miraculous things we've never seen before, in movies and other things. as far as the quote unquote animated feature of yore, that was invented obviously by Pixar, and even the new version, with CG with Toy Story in 1995. And the movie industry has been conflicted about that, meaning conflicted in that they decided at one point in around the year 2000 that was the end of hand-drawn animation. Everything is CG now. That was a thing that it kind of went out there. And then it goes out there. And if you look back at some of those films, even Shrek, or Ants, I guess, it's like that. They look pretty primitive to us today. They were state of the art when they came out, but they're pretty primitive compared to the recent animated features by any studio. DreamWorks and Blue Sky and Disney itself and Frozen and this. There's two camps in the current world of CG features. There's what I call CG puppet camp, and that was what the original CG movies were. What do I mean by that? Again, I know the people who worked on like Frozen, for example, they would quickly, go after me with the pitchforks and the torches, but essentially they build the characters in the computer and they animate the character in the computer. I get it. I get that. The other camp doing what I call the cartoony side. One is puppets. The other one is actually making cartoons. And I can't say exactly when that started. Pixar was experimenting with it. They made a great short called Presto a while back, and then Inside Out, and many others. And those are what I call the cartoony movies, where they look more like the hand of an animator, a hand-drawn artist is manipulating these CG characters in great cartoony ways. A person who's great at it is Genndy Tartakovsky, guy who did the Hotel Transylvania movies and many other things for TV. And he was great. Those Hotel Transylvania movies are fantastic. They're his artwork style, but translated to CG and with extreme poses like Chuck Jones used to make, and great fun animation in them throughout. Just, you just like looking at the images because they're just so fun, the way they're drawn, the way they're actually done. So it's an interesting period. We're still experimenting with all that. And the thing about hand-drawn animation, the thing about animation in general is style of animation is whatever anybody wants to be. If you are an artist, if you're a cartoonist, you can have your style animated, whether by hand or now by CG. It can actually look like you did it. You remember there was a few years ago they came out with the Peanuts movie, and it was I thought it worked out really good. I don't know how it did at the box office, but it was perfect. It was a CG Peanuts, but it looked exactly like Charles Schulz. I thought it was fantastic in terms of they actually were able to translate the technique very well. Another film came out around the same time. I'm not saying it's a great film, but I enjoyed it a lot. Was Captain Underpants.
Yes,
but it was based on the guy's drawing style, and it was cool. It was neat that they're able. I mean, it didn't look like Frozen. It didn't look like Brave or these Disney style movies. It had its own unique feel, and I'm a big proponent of that. I want to see that. Mitchell's versus the Machines, a fantastic use of that, applying that same idea that it's one artist's vision of how you make a film. One of the pioneers, and should get credit for it more than he may get, is Brad Bird, the guy who did The Incredibles and many other films. He was very much, I was going to say late to the game, but he was very much resistant to CG because he was a hand-drawn guy, and as most people working in CG are, but he was a hand-drawn artist. He really knew there were things I can draw that you cannot do on that computer, and he forced and pushed Pixar into developing the systems and things to make it the way he wanted it to be. That film is actually quite the breakthrough because there's poses in there and of characters that the computer would not calculate and do because it's not real, but it's what an artist would do. There's a great clip online somewhere of him showing that there's a scene where Mr. Incredible picks up a car, and here's how it was on the storyboard. Here's the original way the computer translated that. And here's what we ended up with after I made them do it the way I wanted them to do. And it's things needed to be figured out. That said, I'm still a nut for hand-drawn. I think that's just, maybe it's me. To me, it's like a folk art.
Hey, you're right. We could go on like this for hours and hours and hours, but our time is running out. Jerry, thanks so much for being with us today and talking about all the animation. And, maybe you'll come back later and we'll fill in the blanks. Like, I still want to ask you about all the influence that Japanese animation had on American animation.
It does today, but the American animation actually had its influence big time on current day anime, but we can talk about that another time.
Okay. Yeah, that can be the topic the next time we talk.
Who is a good historian of music used in early cartoons?
There's only one, Daniel Goldmark. He lives in Ohio. He teaches at, he's in Cincinnati, the big school there, Case Western or something.
Yeah.
And he's written 2 books on music and animation, and he's the historian. He's the me of talking about exactly that subject. He very up on all that, including current day Alf Clausen on The Simpsons and others. Right. He's really up to date on all of that. So
terrific. Thank you.
Jerry, thanks again. This has been tremendous.
Okay, well, I hope so. I don't know, but anytime. And if you need other pointing in other directions of other experts on that, that's what an expert is, as they've said. An expert is a person who knows where all the other experts are.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Our lovely little podcast is available everywhere good podcasts are found. Listen on your favorite platform, and if you like what you hear, please give us a good rating.
And spread the word. Tell your friends about the Innertube and let them know they can subscribe to the podcast on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
There you can listen to all of our podcasts, see pictures and biographies of our guests, and contact us. You can even click on the microphone button in the lower right corner to leave us a voicemail.
And don't forget to leave your email address on our Talk to the Tube page so we can stay in touch.
And you can email us directly at musicalinnertube@gmail.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.